It was the kind of night that pretends to be warm, golden light spilling over polished plates, the soft hum of conversation. But underneath, the air carried a chill that settled straight into my chest. Faces turned toward one another, their laughter weaving tight circles I wasn't invited into, while my place at the table felt like a seat for a stranger. The fire burned bright for everyone else. The cold found only me. Each small gesture, each careful omission pressed deeper than the last, until the weight of it all became something I could no longer carry home unchanged. What happened before I walked out would stain the rest of their lives, though they didn't see it coming. I'll take you through every step, every quiet cut that led there. If this already grips you, hit like, subscribe for what's next, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from so I know how far this story travels. I had been telling myself all afternoon that this birthday dinner would be fine, that maybe I was imagining the distance that had grown between me and my family over the last few years. The truck ride over was long enough for me to cycle through every possible version of the evening. Warm hugs and cake, a toast, maybe even some laughter that felt like it used to. But the truth is, when I pulled into Nathan's driveway and saw the faint flicker of the fireplace through the living room window, I felt more like I was walking into someone else's celebration. The air was sharp and dry, biting at my face as I stepped out of the truck, and I adjusted the collar of my coat before knocking on the door. The glass panel rattled lightly under my knuckles, and I could see Lauren's silhouette approaching. She opened it quickly enough, but the smile I expected didn't reach her eyes. She stepped aside, letting me in without a word, and I caught a whiff of cinnamon and roasted meat drifting from the kitchen. That smell should have been comforting, but the warmth in it didn't match the chill in the room. My boots clicked against the hardwood as I walked into the dining area, my gaze sweeping the table automatically. It didn't take long to spot my place. It was shoved right against a narrow window, open just enough for the icy air to snake in. The curtains fluttered faintly, and each time the draft hit my back, it was like a cold hand pressing between my shoulders. The rest of the table was arranged in a neat, inviting curve around the fireplace, chairs angled toward one another, close enough for easy conversation. My seat might as well have been in another room. Nathan, standing near the head of the table, gestured toward the chair with a casual flick of his hand before turning back to Greg to finish whatever story he was telling. No one said a thing about moving it or closing the window. I set my coat on the back of the chair and pulled it out, the legs scraping the floor in a way that seemed to draw brief glances from a few of them before they looked away. The draft immediately curled around me as I sat down, lifting the edge of the tablecloth every few seconds. I reached for the place, setting in front of me, and my fingers brushed over the fork's dull surface. The handle was scratched, the metal tarnished to a cloudy gray, the knife blade nicked and warped from years of use. My spoon had a slight bend at the neck, like it had once been caught in a garbage disposal and barely straightened back out. I let my eyes wander down the length of the table and saw the gleam of polished silver catching the firelight at every other place. Matching sets, perfectly aligned, reflecting the glow. The contrast was so sharp it was impossible to see it as an oversight. This had been set up with care, just not for me. I tried to shake off the thought, telling myself I was here to spend time with my family, not to scrutinize flatware. But the truth sat heavy in my chest. Birthdays used to mean something different here. Me at the head of the table, my wife beside me, my sons leaning in to talk, laughter rolling through the room. Now it felt like I was being managed, kept in a spot that wouldn't disturb the picture they wanted to present. Conversation started up around me, but didn't reach me. Nathan and Greg discussed ski trips and renovations. Lauren compared menus from restaurants I'd never been invited to. A few times, someone's gaze drifted toward me, but it was quick, almost guilty before they looked away. I caught sight of the fire flickering in the corner, the light dancing off the glass of wine in front of Greg, the glow wrapping around everyone else like a shared blanket I couldn't touch. The cold from the window was relentless, creeping past my coat and into my bones. I shifted in my seat, tugging my coat tighter, but the draft found its way in anyway. My hands rested on the table, fingers tracing the shallow grooves in the knife handle, feeling each imperfection. I wanted to believe this was just clumsy hosting, that maybe they'd been too busy to notice, but the neat symmetry of everything else told me otherwise. The plates were spotless, the napkins crisply folded, the centerpiece artfully arranged in the middle of the warm, well-lit arc of chairs. Everything designed for comfort, except my corner. I tried to join in on a conversation about a new restaurant, but my words fell into the air and sank without a ripple. I stayed quiet in my drafty corner, watching the others pass around steaming platters of roast and bowls of potatoes, each person helping themselves with the polished serving spoons that glinted under the chandelier. My own plate remained bare except for the worn silverware in front of me. I decided to add something from the dish I had brought along, my wife's old cornbread recipe, the one that had been a family favorite for decades. It was moist, golden, and still warm from the oven when I'd wrapped it up at home, the smell carrying me back to summers when the kids would fight over the first slice. I reached into the paper bag I had brought in from the truck and set the dish on the edge of the table, thinking it might be one of the few things tonight that could bridge the distance between me and the rest of them. Nathan's eyes landed on it almost instantly, and for a moment, I thought he might smile or at least acknowledge it. Instead, he stood, walked over, and without a word, picked up the dish, carrying it into the kitchen. I assumed he was going to plate it up or bring it to the center of the table. But a few seconds later, I heard the familiar clink of the dog's bowl and the patter of paws on the tile floor. Lauren's laugh was the first thing I heard, sharp and sudden, and then Greg chuckled too, making some remark about how Ranger's going to eat like a king tonight. My jaw tightened, the taste of salt rising in my throat as I realized they'd just given my cornbread to the dog. I glanced toward the kitchen and saw Ranger happily tearing into it, crumbs scattering across the floor. No one asked if I'd brought it for them. No one even offered an apology. It was like the message from the drafty seat and the dull cutlery had just been underlined in bold. I reached for my water, my hand steady, even though the cold from the window felt sharper now. I wanted to say something, but the moment had already moved on for them. They were back to talking about ski lodges and wine clubs, the cornbread forgotten except for the crumbs sticking to the dog's fur. My eyes wandered to the wall behind Nathan, where a new frame caught the light. It was a large family photo, one I didn't remember being taken. Everyone was there, Nathan, Greg, Lauren, the kids, all dressed for summer, standing in front of the lake house. I recognized the shirt I was wearing, the pale blue one my wife had always said brought out my eyes. But in this picture, my body was cut cleanly at the shoulder, my face barely half visible on the edge of the frame. The rest of the photo was perfectly balanced, their smiling faces centered, the composition deliberate. It wasn't a mistake. The caption scrawled in the corner in neat cursive said, "Family Summer 2023, as if I'd been some passerby who happened to wander into the edge of the shot. Greg noticed me looking and said, almost offhand, "Oh yeah, the frame wasn't big enough to fit everyone, so we had to trim a little." His tone carried no apology, just the casual certainty that my absence from the full picture didn't really matter. My hands rested on the table, fingers curling against the wood. I could feel the cold draft tugging at the edge of my sleeve again, a steady reminder that my place here wasn't where the warmth was. I thought about the years of birthdays I'd hosted, the meals I'd cooked from scratch, the times I'd made sure every seat was in the circle, that every face was in the photo. Tonight, I was learning what it felt like when no one made that effort for you. Ranger barked once in the kitchen, a happy sound that got another laugh from Lauren. I caught her glance toward me, A quick, assessing look, like she was checking to see if I'd react. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I kept my expression neutral, though inside I could feel something shifting, a slow, heavy pull toward the understanding that this wasn't just carelessness, it was deliberate. The conversations rolled on, the photo gleamed in its place, and the cornbread that should have been shared sat in a half-empty bowl on the kitchen floor. The warmth from the fire never reached my side of the table, and neither did any gesture that felt like family. It was only the beginning of the evening, but already I knew this was going to be more than just a disappointing birthday. It was a turning point, though they didn't know it yet. Lauren began handing out bingo cards one by one, sliding them across the polished wood to each person. When she got to me, she hesitated just long enough for it to register before placing a card down at my setting. I glanced at it and almost laughed, not from amusement, but from the absurdity. The entire B column was missing, not crossed out, not blank for free spaces, just a vertical strip of empty cardboard where numbers should have been printed. I turned the card over, thinking maybe it was a misprint, but the back was smooth, no sign of damage, no torn paper where numbers might have been. It was as if someone had deliberately chosen this card for me. I looked up and caught Greg watching me with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of expression that dared me to point out so he could act surprised. I placed the card flat on the table without comment, deciding not to give him the satisfaction. The game started, Nathan calling out numbers with the energy of a man hosting a small-town carnival. Everyone else eagerly marked their cards, squares filling with bright red chips, bursts of "got it" and "bingo's coming" bouncing across the table. I sat quietly, marking what I could, knowing there was no way I could win, even if I got every possible call in the other columns. No one asked how I was doing, no one noticed I wasn't in the running, or maybe they noticed and just liked it that way. The fire crackled on the other side of the room. The draft kept sneaking under my collar, and the smell of wine and roast still lingered in the air. Then Greg stood, a bottle of red cradled in his hand, the label expensive enough to make a point. "Refills," he said, moving around the table like a sommelier at a private club. He poured generous servings into the crystal goblets in front of Nathan and Lauren, then topped off his own. When he reached me, he pulled a different glass from the sideboard, shorter, thicker, with a chip along the rim just big enough to catch the light. He poured a modest splash into it, set it in front of me, and said in a mock casual voice, "Dad's steadier hands will handle it better than the kids." The implication was clear, the jab about age disguised as a compliment. A few chuckles rippled through the table, not loud enough to be outright cruel, but loud enough to confirm everyone had heard. I lifted the glass and turned it slightly, the chipped edge rough under my thumb. The wine smelled rich, almost sweet, but the metallic tang of the glass made me think twice about drinking it. Still, I took a small sip, letting it rest on my tongue while I kept my eyes on Greg. He had already moved on, pouring more for Lauren and leaning over to whisper something that made her laugh. The bingo game rolled toward its inevitable conclusion. Lauren called bingo and claimed a small prize Nathan had wrapped in shiny paper. My card lay in front of me, hopelessly incomplete, the missing column a silent reminder of where I stood in this house. I glanced toward the kitchen and saw a ranger curled up in the corner, his muzzle resting on the plate that had once held my cornbread. The image stuck with me, not because of the food, but because it felt like a perfect mirror of how I'd been treated all evening, given the scraps, left in the corner, ignored unless it was for amusement. I placed the glass carefully on the table, the chip catching the firelight again, and leaned back in my chair. My body felt heavier, the cold draft less like an accident and more like a choice someone had made long before I walked through the door. Greg disappeared briefly and returned with a large, tiered cake stand, the glossy chocolate glaze catching the firelight as if it were part of the room's decoration. It was a beautiful cake, thick layers of sponge, careful piping around the edges, the kind of effort I hadn't seen from them in years. And for a fleeting second, I thought perhaps this was the part of the evening where they'd shift, where someone might light candles and call everyone's attention to the reason we were here. But instead of a pause for a song or a toast, Lauren took up the knife and began slicing without ceremony, cutting generous, picture-perfect wedges for Nathan, Greg, and the kids. She placed each piece upright on pristine plates, the kind with the subtle gold rim that only came out on holidays. Then, when she reached me, she used the flat of the knife to slide a single slice onto a plain white plate, the cake collapsing forward under its own weight so that it landed face down in the smear of its own frosting. The piped rosettes were crushed, the layers hidden beneath the smeared glaze, and she set it in front of me without meeting my eyes. "Here you go," she said, already turning away to cut the next piece for someone else. I stared at it for a moment, the sweet smell heavy in the air, the presentation so deliberately careless it could only have been intentional. Around me, forks clinked against porcelain, children hummed in approval of their first bites. Nathan poured coffee into matching mugs that never made their way to my side of the table. I picked up my fork and took a bite, not because I was hungry, but because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me push it away. The cake was good, moist, rich, perfectly balanced, but the taste sat on my tongue like something spoiled. Midway through dessert, my napkin slipped from my lap and fluttered to the floor. I bent to pick it up, my hand brushing the cold hardwood, and in that brief moment, I felt the legs of my chair shift. When I straightened, I realized they had pushed me another foot away from the table. My plate was now an awkward distance, forcing me to lean forward if I wanted another bite, my knees barely grazing the table edge. No one said a word about it. Nathan was busy telling Greg about a new set of golf clubs. Lauren was sipping her coffee while scrolling through something on her phone, and the kids were already asking for seconds. I adjusted the chair back toward the table, but the motion scraped loudly enough across the floor that every head turned for a split second before looking away again. Lauren began moving around the table again, collecting stray forks and half-empty mugs, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood, and I realized this was probably the last moment I'd have to give my grandson the small package in my coat pocket. I had been working on it for weeks, carving the wood in the evenings, sanding each edge until it was smooth, fitting it with tiny brass hinges so the lid would open cleanly. It was a keepsake box about the size of a paperback, with his initials carved in a style my father had taught me. The boy was only 12, but I'd wanted him to have something for my hands, something that wasn't store-bought or disposable, something that might outlast me. When Lauren passed behind my chair, I reached into my coat and pulled it out, the polished surface catching the low light. I called my grandson's name, and he looked up from the phone he was holding, eyes briefly curious. I slid the box across the table toward him, telling him I'd made it for him to keep his favorite things. He picked it up, turned it over once, then gave a small shrug before passing it to his mother. Lauren took it with a tight smile, said, "Oh, this will look nice outside," and without waiting for my reply, she walked toward the porch. I watched through the window as she placed it on top of a large planter, tucking it between the leaves of a fern as if it were nothing more than seasonal decor. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table, the chill from the glass between me and the night pressing against my chest. I could still see the brass hinges glinting faintly in the porch light, my initials for him barely visible between the leaves. The boy had already gone back to his phone, and whatever moment I'd hoped to create had been buried under a layer of dirt and foliage. I tried to steady my breathing, to keep my face neutral as Nathan stood and stretched, drawing attention to the watch on his wrist. My watch. I had bought it decades ago after finishing one of the largest jobs of my career, a custom-built staircase for a historic inn. It had been my first real luxury purchase, a solid gold piece with a deep blue face, worn smooth on the underside from years of use. I hadn't worn it much since my wife passed, but it had stayed in my drawer, safe, a reminder of what I'd built with my own two hands. Now it was on Nathan's arm, the strap slightly loose, the face catching the light as he gestured. "Feels good," he said, rotating his wrist as if testing its weight. "And it'll suit a younger wrist better in the future." The words were delivered casually, but they landed like a hammer, an open claim on something that was still mine, still a part of me. A couple of chuckles rose from the table, Greg leaning over to get a better look, Lauren glancing in my direction as if to see if I'd protest. I didn't. The memory of my cornbread in the dog's bowl, my half-body in the photo frame, the missing numbers on my bingo card, the chipped glass, the face-down cake, and now my gift left in the dirt. They stacked together in my mind, each one another layer in the wall they were building between us. The warmth from the fire was still trapped in the circle where their chairs touched, and my spot by the open window had become a place where cold air pooled like water in a low ditch. The sight of my watch on Nathan's wrist and my grandson's keepsake box sitting forgotten among the fern leaves on the porch had settled like a stone in my chest, heavy enough that I barely noticed when Lauren began moving through the room again, collecting stray coats and jackets. My own sweater, a thick wool one I knitted myself years ago, was draped across the back of my chair, the faint scent of cedar clinging to it from where it had been stored for winter. It was warm, comfortable, and familiar, one of the few things that still made me feel at ease in this house. I noticed her pause as she reached for it, her manicured fingers hesitating for only a fraction of a second before she pinched it between her thumb and forefinger as if she were handling something delicate or unpleasant. She didn't fold it or place it neatly over the back of the chair again. Instead, she carried it toward the mudroom, and through the sliver of view past the kitchen, I saw her open the side door that led toward the shed. A moment later, she reappeared without it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I excused myself briefly to glance through the side window. There was my sweater hung on a hook nailed into the siding next to the shed door, swaying slightly in the night air. The wind caught at the sleeves, making them twist like they were trying to escape, and I could already imagine how cold it would be to put it back on later. She must have sensed me watching because when I stepped back into the dining room, she smiled and said in a light, airy voice, "Just wanted to keep the smell out of the living room. You know how it can hold on to food odors." The others chuckled as if she'd just made a clever household tip, and Nathan nodded like it was perfectly reasonable. I didn't argue, but I felt the chill from the open window behind me deepen, seeping into my bones now that the extra layer of warmth was gone. Greg clapped his hands and suggested a trivia game to get everyone's brains working after all that food. He produced a stack of cards from a box and took the role of quizmaster, his grin wide as he began asking questions around the table. The first few went to the kids: pop culture, current sports stats, the latest streaming shows, things I wouldn't have been expected to know. But when my turn came, Greg looked down at the card and then seemed to change his mind, riffling through the deck until he found one that made him smirk. "All right, Dad," he said, "this should be right up your alley. In what year did the Korean War begin?" I answered automatically, my voice flat, and he nodded like a teacher indulging an average student. The next time it was my turn, the question was about Eisenhower's presidency. The next one after that, the name of the Soviet premier during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It didn't take long to realize that every single question aimed at me was about the Cold War, the 1950s, or the early 1960s, a slow, deliberate pattern meant to box me into a particular corner of time. Nathan chuckled after one answer and said, "Man, you really are our resident historian," as if I were some relic brought out for entertainment. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel in volume, but in tone, the kind that slid under the skin and stayed there. I looked down the table at the bright faces lit by the fireplace, the smooth hands passing cards and mugs, and felt the decades between us like a physical wall. I thought of the sweater hanging outside in the cold, the gift on the porch, my watch on Nathan's wrist, and all the small humiliations that had led us here tonight. The trivia game carried on for another half hour, and each time Greg turned toward me with a card in his hand, I could see the satisfaction in his eyes before he even read the question. The trivia game ended with Greg announcing himself the winner and tossing the cards back into the box as if he had just completed a job well done, and the others laughed, the room buzzing with the same easy camaraderie they'd been sharing all evening, a camaraderie that I knew would never reach my end of the table. I could still see my sweater hanging outside by the shed door in the darkness, the sleeves twisting in the wind like they were trying to pull free from the hook, and I thought about how cold it would be when I finally left tonight. My mind wandered back to the watch on Nathan's wrist, to the keepsake box sitting in the planter, to the cake smashed face down on the plate, to the chipped glass, to the missing bingo numbers, to the half body in the family photo, and the cornbread crumbs scattered in the dog's bowl. Each memory stacked on the one before it, building a clear, undeniable picture in my mind. The decision I had been dancing around for months began to crystallize into something final, and I realized that there was no reason to wait until the night was over to set it in motion. I took a slow sip of my cooling coffee and excused myself to the bathroom, though the moment I stepped into the hallway, I turned toward the front door instead. The night air hit me hard, crisp and clean compared to the stale warmth of the dining room, and I walked toward my truck, my shoes crunching against the thin crust of frost that had begun to form. I opened the driver's side door, reached across the seat, and slid the small black key from my pocket into the lock of the metal safe bolted onto the dashboard. The click of the latch was louder than I expected in the quiet night. Inside was a thick envelope, the edges worn slightly from where I had handled it over the past few weeks, reading and rereading the words inside. I pulled it out carefully, my fingers brushing the embossed seal of my lawyer's office, and opened it just enough to see the neatly typed document within, the amended will and estate transfer papers I had signed 2 weeks ago. Every property, every account, every asset was now directed toward a scholarship fund named after my late wife to be used for students from working-class families who needed help to build their futures. Not a cent would go to Nathan or Greg or Lauren or any of their households. I closed the envelope, slid it back into the safe, and locked it, the sound of the latch snapping shut giving me a satisfaction I hadn't felt all night. Then I reached for my coat, still hanging over the seat from when I arrived, and opened the inside pocket. Inside were a series of cream-colored cards with raised lettering, formal invitations to the scholarship fund's launch ceremony in the spring. Each card had their names printed on it, but only as guests, not as honorees, not as beneficiaries. They would sit in the audience like anyone else, watching the speeches, seeing the slideshow of students' faces, realizing in real time that this was where their inheritance had gone. I slid the cards back into the pocket and zipped it shut, then stood for a moment with my hand resting on the truck's doorframe, looking back toward the glow of the dining room window. From here, the scene almost looked warm, almost inviting, but I knew the truth of the draft from the open window, the distance between my chair and theirs, the way they had taken each opportunity to make me smaller in my own family. I walked back inside, the hum of conversation washing over me the moment I closed the door. No one asked where I'd been. Nathan was refilling his wine. Greg was showing something on his phone to Lauren. The kids were playing a game in the corner. I slipped my coat over the back of my chair, my fingers brushing the pocket where the invitations rested, and sat down without saying a word. The draft from the window was still there, steady and cold, but it no longer felt like it was chasing me out. It felt like a reminder of the distance I had chosen to keep. I picked up my fork, stabbed the last crumb of my cake, and let the sweetness dissolve on my tongue, already tasting the satisfaction of what was to come. When I sat back down after returning from my truck, the conversation at the table continued without a hitch, as if my absence hadn't even been noticed. Nathan was still wearing my watch. Greg was still smiling that self-satisfied smile from his trivia victory. Lauren was sipping her coffee while occasionally glancing toward the porch where the keepsake box sat nestled in the planter. My sweater was still hanging by the shed door outside, its sleeves gently twisting in the cold wind, and the draft from the open window beside me continued to press against my back like an uninvited hand. I sipped the last of my coffee and let the warmth pool in my chest, not because the drink was particularly good, but because I knew what was coming next, and there was a certain satisfaction in the calm before the change. Nathan suggested another round of drinks, but I declined, pushing my chair back slightly and feeling the familiar scrape of the legs against the hardwood. No one looked up when I stood, so I took a moment to let my gaze travel across the room, memorizing the scene, my sons and their spouses comfortable in their circle, the flickering firelight on their faces, the kids in the corner with their games. Then I reached into my coat pocket, the one where the invitations to the scholarship ceremony were tucked away, and felt the smooth edge of the spare key to my house. They had insisted on having it years ago, saying it was for emergencies, but it had become more of a symbol to them, a subtle reminder that they had access to my space whenever they wanted it. I walked to the table and, without a word, placed the key in the center between the empty coffee cups and dessert plates. The small metallic clink was loud enough to draw Lauren's eyes for a brief second before she looked back at her phone. Nathan didn't even glance up. I turned toward the front door, retrieved my coat from the back of my chair, and slipped it on, zipping the pocket closed over the invitations. "Thanks for the evening," I said, my voice steady but quiet, and though it was clear from their lack of response that they had already moved on to whatever topic mattered to them more than my departure, I didn't repeat myself. I stepped outside into the cold, the air sharper now, each breath visible as it left my mouth. My sweater swung on the hook by the shed as I passed, but I didn't take it down. I walked to my truck, opened the door, and slid inside, starting the engine and feeling the hum through the seat. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced once in the rearview mirror at the warm light spilling from their windows, knowing it was the last time I would see it from this perspective. The road was quiet, the occasional crunch of ice under my tires the only sound, and by the time I reached my own driveway, the night had settled into a deep stillness. Inside my house, I hung my coat by the door and poured myself a glass of water, setting it on the kitchen counter while I retrieved my phone. I sat at the table, opened my email, and drafted a short message to my lawyer. It's time. Within minutes, the scheduled email we had prepared earlier in the week was sent out to Nathan, Greg, and Lauren. Attached was a high-resolution photo of the signed estate transfer document, the embossed seal catching the light in the picture, along with the legal confirmation that the change had been executed and filed. Beneath, it was a single sentence in my handwriting. "Thank you for helping me see things clearly." I set the phone down on the table, the glass of water untouched beside it, and leaned back in my chair. I could almost picture the moment their phones lit up. The flicker of confusion as they opened the email, the shift from disbelief to anger, the sudden realization that the inheritance they had assumed was theirs had already found a new home. I imagined the silence in their living room as they processed it, the way their comfortable circle might shrink for the first time when they understood what they had lost. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but in here the air was still, the warmth from the heater steady, my space exactly as I liked it. I reached for the invitations in my coat pocket, fanned them out on the table, and studied their names printed neatly in black ink beneath the words Guest of Honor Ceremony Caldwell Scholarship Fund. They would have their seats, but not the ones they had expected. The stage was set, And all that was left now was to wait for the day when the final piece of this quiet revenge would play out in front of an audience that would understand exactly why it had been done. The night after I sent the email was quiet, my phone free of calls or messages from any of them, though I knew they had read it. Probably more than once, probably in silence first, and then in a storm of words once the shock wore off. I slept better than I had in months, not because I was free of their disrespect, but because I had acted on it in a way that couldn't be undone. Days passed without contact, and then small ripples of the fallout began to reach me from places they didn't expect. The first was Greg. I heard about him through an old friend who still worked at the bank downtown, a man I'd known since high school who didn't give me the details outright, but let enough slip in casual conversation for me to piece it together. Without my name as a co-signer, Greg's financial profile was weaker than he had thought, and the investment apartment he'd bought to rent out had been hanging by a thread for months. The tenants had moved out after a plumbing disaster. The repairs had cost more than he could cover, and the bank had been patient only because my backing had kept them calm. Once they realized that backing was gone, they moved fast. The apartment was repossessed, the locks changed, and the for sale sign was in the window before Greg had even removed his furniture. I imagined the moment he realized the safety net he had assumed there was no longer under him. And though I didn't take pleasure in his loss, I did feel the weight of his arrogance shifting into something heavier for him to carry. Not long after, I heard about Nathan's trouble. This time it came from a mutual acquaintance who had been to an auction in the city. Among the lots was a collection of vintage Bordeaux and Burgundy wines, carefully curated, rare enough to draw attention from serious collectors. Nathan had spent years building that collection, storing it in a climate-controlled cabinet, showing it off to guests as if it were a tangible symbol of his success. It was the kind of thing he loved to talk about in the same tone he used when discussing his ski trips and club memberships, more about image than enjoyment. But without my name attached to his credit line, the bank had cut his limits sharply, and the business venture he'd been funneling money into suddenly needed a cash infusion. Selling the wine had been his choice, but I knew it wasn't one he'd made lightly. I could picture him standing in that auction room, watching strangers raise their paddles for bottles he'd once bragged would be opened only for the most special occasions. I imagined the tightening in his jaw, the calculation in his eyes, as the reality settled and that the safety net was gone for him too. Neither of them called me. Neither showed up at my door to shout or to plead. Instead, the silence stretched between us, a silence filled with the knowledge that their assumptions about the future had been wrong. I went about my days as I always had. Mornings in the workshop, afternoons walking the back trails behind my property, evenings with a book or a game on the radio. But every now and then, I would think about the key I had left on their table, the small metallic sound it had made as it landed, and how that sound had been the true start of their unraveling. The scholarship paperwork was moving forward smoothly. My lawyer called to confirm the final arrangements for the ceremony in the spring, the venue booked, the first group of recipients already selected. Hearing about those students, their grades, their ambitions, their stories of working after school to help their families, only strengthened my conviction. This money, my life's work, would go where it was truly needed. On the rare occasion that I passed through town and saw Greg's car parked outside the diner, or Nathan in line at the hardware store, I kept walking. We didn't meet eyes. We didn't speak. The distance they had spent years creating between us now worked both ways, and I had no interest in crossing it. Their lives were shifting without the anchor they had taken for granted, and I knew there was more to come. This was only the beginning of the consequences. The weeks after Greg lost his apartment and Nathan sold his wine collection were quiet on the surface, but I could feel the ripples of change spreading through them in ways they wouldn't admit. People in this town notice things. Who sells what? who cancels memberships, who stops hosting the gatherings they once used to flaunt their status. That's how I heard about Lauren. For years, she had built her image on being the centerpiece of the neighborhood social scene, hosting charity galas in their backyard under rented white tents, dressing in designer outfits for the local arts fundraiser, posing for photos with oversized checks to be published in the community newsletter. She liked being known as the woman who could gather 100 people with a week's notice and raise 5 figures for a cause. But when the annual hospital benefit rolled around, I heard she quietly declined the invitation. She gave no reason in public, but a mutual acquaintance told me the truth. Without the inheritance they've been banking on, without my quiet but consistent support for the extras in their lives, she couldn't meet the minimum donation required to secure a hosting spot. She stayed home that night while the rest of the old crowd gathered under the tent, her absence as noticeable as a missing tooth in a smile. I didn't gloat when I heard. I just noted it, the way you mark a milestone on a long road, not because it's a victory, but because it means you're nearing the end of a journey. Winter gave way to spring, and the day of a scholarship fund launch arrived bright and clear. The hall my lawyer had booked was filled with rows of folding chairs, a modest stage at the front draped with a banner bearing my wife's name in bold letters. Students and their families filled the seats, some dressed in Sunday best, others in simple clothes that had clearly been chosen with care. Their faces were a mix of nervousness and pride, each one holding the knowledge that this opportunity would change the course of their lives. I wore my best suit, the same one I'd worn to my wife's funeral, and as I stepped onto the stage, the applause rose in a way I hadn't felt in years, genuine, warm, without a trace of pretense. I spoke briefly about the value of hard work, about my wife's belief that education could be the ladder out of any hole, and about the satisfaction of knowing that the work of my hands would now help build something lasting for people who truly needed it. Then I began calling the names, handing out envelopes, and shaking hands as each student came forward. Their smiles were real, their gratitude unfiltered, and in those moments I felt the weight of every slight, every cold draft, every chipped glass, every half-body photo, and every scrap of dismissal from that birthday night dissolve into something I could leave behind. Toward the back of the hall, I saw them. Nathan in a suit that looked like it hadn't been tailored in years, Greg with a tight jaw, Lauren with a stiff smile that didn't reach her eyes. They were standing, not sitting, their arms crossed, their bodies angled away from the stage, as if they weren't sure whether they wanted to be seen. They hadn't been invited to speak, hadn't been listed anywhere in the program, and the only reason they were here at all was printed on the cards I'd placed in my coat pocket months ago. Guest. When our eyes met briefly, there was no flash of anger, no sign of outrage, just the slow dawning of realization that the future they had built in their minds had been replaced entirely, and they had done nothing to stop it. I finished the ceremony, posed for photos with the recipients, and when the crowd began to thin, I stepped down from the stage and walked toward them. I didn't offer my hand. I didn't need to. The message had already been delivered months ago, in the way they had treated me, in the way I had responded, and now in the way they were standing in a room full of people whose lives would be better because of the legacy they had forfeited. We left without speaking, going in opposite directions into the afternoon sunlight. As I drove home, I thought about the key I had left on their table, the finality of that small metallic sound, and how it had marked the point when I stopped waiting for them to see me as something worth valuing. In the end, the money didn't go to the people who share my blood, but to the people who would honor the spirit of the work it took to earn it. That was the legacy my wife would have wanted, and it was the one I chose to leave. The end. If you've been with me through this whole story, you know it wasn't just about one birthday or one bad evening. It was about years of small cuts that finally made me choose a different path. I shared every moment, from that cold draft at the window to the look on their faces in the back of the hall when they realized the inheritance they'd counted on was gone. I want to know what you think. Did I make the right choice? Would you have done the same if it were your family? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I'd like to know how far this story has reached. If you felt something in the way this unfolded, whether it made you angry, sad, or quietly satisfied, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next time I sit down and tell you a story from my life. Your thoughts matter to me, and I read every single one.